Hello and welcome back. So today I'm going to discuss with you the Sri Lanka crisis. What is the crisis all about? Why did this crisis happen? What is the road ahead for Sri Lanka? And what are the lessons that we can learn from this crisis? Okay, so first I'll talk to you about the present state of Sri Lanka. Next, I'll talk to you about how did Sri Lanka reach here. So what are the basic problems because of which the country reached in this position? What is the road ahead? That is, how can Sri Lanka come out of this crisis? How can Sri Lanka come out of this crisis? Okay, this is what I'll discuss with you in this section. And finally, what are the lessons to be learned from this crisis? What can we and the rest of the world learn from Sri Lanka? Okay, so let's get started. First, we'll talk about the present state of Sri Lanka. First, Sri Lanka is facing its worst economic crisis since its independence in 1948, right? This is the worst economic crisis that Sri Lanka has been facing since its independence in 1948. Next, the country has a foreign debt of around $51 billion. That's a huge debt. Okay, the country has a foreign debt of $51 billion. Out of this $51 billion, Sri Lanka is supposed to pay $25 billion by 2026. So by 2026, Sri Lanka is supposed to pay back $25 billion. And out of this $25 billion, Sri Lanka is supposed to pay back $7 billion. $7 billion by this year. Okay. But what happened? The country has now said that it is suspending paying $7 billion for this year because it simply doesn't have the money to pay back to its foreign debtors. Okay. So this is the present situation. Next, Sri Lanka is facing a twin deficit problem. In fact, if I have to tell you that the crux of the problem that Sri Lanka is facing is really the twin deficit problem, or the twin deficit theory that we call. Now the question is, what is the twin deficit problem? Let me explain this to you. Okay, so we'll understand what is the twin deficit problem. Twin deficit problem. Okay, so you see, twin deficit, this term tells you there's a term twin here. Twin essentially means two things happening simultaneously. So there are two deficits that are happening simultaneously for Sri Lanka. Okay, these two deficits are, first is the current account deficit, that is the first deficit, and the second one is the budget deficit. Okay, so these are the two deficits that are happening simultaneously for Sri Lanka. Okay, now let's first understand what is the current account deficit. Current account deficit, in simple terms, it means that import of Sri Lanka, okay, is much more than its exports. Okay, that's the, in very simple words, that is what current account deficit means. The amount of value of goods that Sri Lanka is importing is much more than its exports. Okay, budget deficit simply means the amount of expenditure of the country. The expenditure is much more than the revenue that it is earning. Okay, that is your budget deficit. Okay, now these two things are happening simultaneously for Sri Lanka. Now the question you might have in your mind is, why is this happening? Why are these two deficits happening simultaneously for India? I'll tell you exactly why this is happening in very short while. I'll come back to this part again. Okay, for now, just understand that Sri Lanka is facing twin deficit problem. It is having current account deficit and budget deficit at the same time. Budget deficit essentially means expenditure is greater than revenue, and current account deficit means import is greater than export. So both of these things, import greater than export and expenditure more than revenue, is happening for Sri Lanka right now. Why is this happening? I'll explain to you in a very short while. Okay, continuing with the present state. Next, because of this twin deficit problem, Sri Lanka is facing a reduction of imports of goods, essential items like food, medicine, cooking oil. All of this Sri Lanka is facing an acute shortage of. And as a result of this, people are having to wait in long lines to get even essential services like food, medicine, cooking, gas, fuel, and all of these things. For simple things which we take for granted, people in Sri Lanka are having to struggle with this. Okay, this is a very, very serious problem that Sri Lanka and the Sri Lankans are facing. Next, the protests. Now, all these acute shortages, obviously people are frustrated, people are not happy, they have come down on the streets, they are protesting against the powerful Rajapaksa political family. In fact, that is the family, the president of Sri Lanka, Gotabaya Rajapaksa. His family runs the entire show in Sri Lanka. Okay, and it is their own doing that Sri Lanka has come to this problem. So people are protesting against the Rajapaksa government. Two of the president's siblings and nephew have resigned from the cabinet post. The prime minister has been removed, okay, and a new prime minister by the name of Vikramasinghe has been brought in, and he has promised to propose constitutional changes to curtail, and this is the important thing, to curtail presidential powers. Because if you see all the problems that Sri Lanka is facing, which I'll tell you in more detail in the next slide, is because of the excessive presidential power that Sri Lankan president has. And the current prime minister has promised to curtail down on Sri Lanka's presidential powers. Right now, Sri Lanka is in talks with different countries, with IMF. Sri Lanka is in talks with India, with China, and many other countries. And Sri Lanka is already getting help from different quarters, okay, from IMF, from India, from China, and from many other countries. So this is the present state of Sri Lanka. Okay. Now the question is, how did Sri Lanka reach here? What are the reasons why Sri Lanka is facing this issue? First, in November 2019, okay, this is the date, November 2019, Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa announced sweeping tax cuts before the parliamentary elections in a few months, okay, and this is the starting of the problem, sweeping tax cuts that Sri Lankan president had announced. Now, the question is, why was sweeping tax cuts a problem? And let's get back to the twin deficit problem, and you'll understand the entire scenario, the problem that Sri Lanka is facing, and the reason why Sri Lanka is facing this. You see, revenue. So, what is the way that governments earn revenue? There are many ways, but one of the biggest means or tool for the government to earn revenues is taxes, right? Governments earn their revenue through taxes from people, from citizens, from businesses, and wherever they can, they get taxes, and that's their essential revenue, apart from various other smaller ones. But tax is the huge chunk of revenue that governments get. Now, when Sri Lanka announced sweeping tax cuts, what happened? Tax cuts down means revenue also goes down, right? Tax cuts down, taxes down means revenue also goes down. When revenues goes down, what happens? The expenditure does not go down, expenditure remains same, but revenues are down. What does it mean? Expenditure becomes much more than revenues. The gap between expenditure and revenue has substantially increased. When the gap increases, what happens? Where do you get the money to fund your expenditure? Taking debt. And Sri Lanka has taken enormous amount of debt. I think I told you that Sri Lanka right now owns around $51 billion of foreign debt. Okay, so Sri Lanka started taking debt. Now next, when there are tax cuts, yes, revenue also goes down, but what also happens? People have more money in their hand, right? People's money in hand also goes up, because now people are paying less taxes, so they have more money in hand to buy things, to do more expenses, right? So when people do more, when people spend more, what happens? They need more amount of goods. When they need more amount of goods, how does the country procure that? They start importing more, because domestically all of the needs of the people, all of the wants of the people cannot be satisfied. So Sri Lanka started importing even more. And also exports also went down. Why? Because many of the exports were used in procuring the domestic demand, right? Domestic demand. Now because of this domestic demand, exports started going down and imports are going up, because lot many things were starting to get imported in huge numbers in order to satisfy the wants of the people. Okay, so now because of this, imports are greater than exports. Okay, so you understood how a tax cut, it leads to lowering revenue, and that's why expenditure goes above revenue. That's one. And so Sri Lanka has to take more debt. That's the second thing. Third, since there are tax cuts, people have more money in their hand. When they have more money in their hand, they want to buy more. How does the country satisfy the wants of the people? They start importing more of those items, and also the export have been declined because many of the domestic production are used in meeting the domestic demand. As a result, imports get much more than exports, and so you have current account deficit here. And since expenditure is more than revenue, you have budget deficit here. Okay, so a one step tax cuts, sweeping tax cuts have led to both current account deficit and budget deficit. Okay, next, I hope you understood how the twin deficit problem has come to arise in Sri Lanka. Next, this was not all. Next, in April 2021, Sri Lanka decided to make agriculture 100% organic. Now see, there's nothing wrong with organic farming. There's nothing wrong with organic farming. In fact, organic farming, there are quite a lot of evidence that it's a good thing. But you cannot just bring in organic farming without putting adequate checks and balances, right? You have to have checks and balances. Now, what happened due to organic farming? The short-term impact of organic farming is that the farm output, that goes down in the short term. Farm output goes down at least in the short term. Okay, in the short term, the farm output goes down. Okay, as a result, what happened? Sri Lanka needed to import more in order to meet the domestic consumption. Okay, next, also what has now been found is that this push for organic farming was not really from an environmental perspective, but rather Sri Lanka wanted to save foreign reserves. What do I mean by this? You see, traditionally Sri Lanka has imported, they have imported chemical fertilizers. Okay, chemical fertilizers were always imported. Okay, now since farming is the 100% organic, so there is no need to import chemical fertilizers. Now since there is no need to import chemical fertilizers, what happens? Your foreign currency reserves are saved. Okay, so let me explain this to you a bit more detail. You see, when you need to import, what happens? So suppose this is country A and this is country B. Okay, now say country A is Sri Lanka, just give me an example, and Sri Lanka is going to import from country B. Okay, it is going to import from country B, but for this Sri Lanka has to pay. Obviously Sri Lanka has to pay to country B. How do they pay? They have to pay, they pay in dollars. They pay in dollars. So they pay in dollars to country B. Now when you import more dollar is going out of your country. What happens when more dollars go out of your country? Your foreign reserves go down. What is foreign reserve? Foreign reserve is essentially the amount of reserve that a country has in terms of, say, dollar. Okay, very simplistically again, the amount of dollar that a country has in its account is a foreign reserve. So right now, for example, India has $650 billion of foreign reserves, right? So that's a healthy number. We'll come to this later. But Sri Lanka, since it started importing more, its foreign reserves started going down. And when foreign reserves start going down, it puts a pressure on the local currency as well. The local currency starts depreciating. Okay, so the local currency starts depreciating. So in order to safeguard dollars moving out of the country, Sri Lanka, the only way it can do is that by pulling down imports. So they thought, why don't you pull down imports of chemical fertilizers? We'll make sure that our country does not need chemical fertilizers. So this entire import cost of chemical fertilizers go down. As a result, they save more on the foreign reserves. Clear? Next, this is the final nail in the coffin. Sri Lanka's 13% of GDP, okay, and it's not at all a small number. 13% of GDP of Sri Lanka comes from tourism, okay, tourism, and also a good portion comes from foreign workers' remittances. But when the COVID pandemic hit, tourism, obviously, it went to a complete standstill, like all other countries in the world. Foreign workers' remittances also was hit very badly. As a result, this entire 13% of GDP, this entire earning from tourism and foreign workers' remittances that Sri Lanka could have got, entirely came to a standstill. Now, again, what did it do? It impacted revenue hugely. Revenue hugely impacted means, again, the budget deficit started soaring up. Okay, the budget deficit started soaring up. Okay, finally, what happens? I'll just delete this part for you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'll just delete this. Yeah. Yes. So credit rating agencies downgraded Sri Lanka. Okay, credit rating agencies started downgrading Sri Lanka. Why did they do that? Because you see, Sri Lanka had huge amount of debt. As I already explained, around $51 billion, and they are simply unable to pay back that debt. Why? Because their revenues are down substantially. Now, when foreign investors invest in your country, they want their money back, they want the returns back, right? But Sri Lanka is been defaulting on that. As a result of this, they have started to downgrade Sri Lanka. And when foreign rating agencies like S&P and Moody and everyone downgrades a country, it becomes very difficult for the country to raise more money from abroad. Okay, so it's like a double whammy. You are unable to pay, so you're being downgraded, and when you're being downgraded, no one else gives you money that you can borrow from. Okay, so that's the problem because of which Sri Lanka reached in this position. First, sweeping tax cuts that we discussed, which led to the twin deficit problem. Second, organic farming that hugely impacts farm growth, that again increases import foreign just to save foreign currency reserves, but again that did not work. Imports, what do you call, farm output, since that were impacted, so Sri Lanka started importing essential items like rice and tea, which Sri Lanka always used to export. They even had to start importing that. Not rice and tea. Never ever Sri Lanka had to think of, just a second. Yeah, never ever Sri Lanka ever had to think of rice, tea as import, right? This to produce this, okay? But again, this single move led to import of rice and tea. Then tourism badly hit during the pandemic, and then foreign rating agencies downgrading Sri Lanka. So all of these things made Sri Lanka reach this position where they are today right now. Okay, as you see, it's all their making. This is bad policy that has led Sri Lanka to come to where it is. This is pure bad policy, purely bad policy. And the only good thing in this is that Sri Lankan administration right now do acknowledge, they have acknowledged on record that yes, it is essentially our making why we have come to into this position. There's one more reason I must add here. Sri Lanka also borrowed heavily to build infrastructure. Okay, they borrowed heavily from country like China. They have borrowed heavily from China to fund different infrastructure projects. But again, those projects were something that did not give them profits, that did not give them earn any revenues. As a result of this, many of these projects have been taken over by China. Okay, that was another blunder that the Rajapaksa administration did. Okay, that also added fuel to the fire. Now, the question is, what's the road ahead for Sri Lanka? So what can Sri Lanka do to come out of this problem? Number one, seek out stimulus package. Now, this is something that Sri Lanka is already doing. It is seeking out stimulus packages from IMF, from India, China, and different other countries. The country is already seeking stimulus packages, but again, it's no easy way. When you seek stimulus packages from different organizations from different countries, you have to be austere in your spending. You need to be austere, or you say frugal. You need to be very austere in your spending. You cannot just spend recklessly like before. Next, Sri Lanka has to curve out corruption from the system. In fact, one of the problems that this government had, the Rajapaksa administration had, was corruption, extreme corruption in the system. Okay, they have to curve out corruption from the system. Curve down presidential powers. This, the Sri Lanka administration already has an understanding. The current Prime Minister Wickremesinghe has already promised that they are going to cut down on presidential powers. But again, when it happens, how it happens, that's something that we have to watch out for. But giving so much of power to one family, to just the president, it simply did not turn out well for Sri Lanka, and it cannot turn out well for any country, right? Power needs to be distributed well across the system. Next, move out of one family rule. We have already discussed this. Sri Lanka's main problem was that it was a one family rule. The Rajapaksa family holding all the cabinet posts, almost all the cabinet posts, all the major powers in the administration, that led to this decline. And finally, bring more accountability in the system, right? Technology has to come in. People need to know what is going on in the system, right? Sri Lanka system is extremely opaque, not transparent. Accountability has to be there. Even it is important for foreign investors. They need to know what is happening inside the country, right? Only then they will have the confidence to lend to the country. So accountability is extremely important. And with the bailout packages and stimulus packages coming in, this will be one of the essential necessities that Sri Lanka has to adhere to, that they have to bring in more accountability into the system. They have to really tell the foreign organizations or the countries as to where they are spending the money that they have borrowed. Okay, so this is this is not going to be an easy path. It's going to be very difficult for Sri Lanka to come out of this. It is going to be a very slow, painstaking path, but if they can follow these measures, at some point in time, Sri Lanka will come out of it. But again, it is going to be very difficult for the country, for its citizens. But again, there's no easy solution to such a major economic crisis. It is going to be painstaking. Now the question is, what can we learn from Sri Lanka? What has happened in Sri Lanka has happened. It is important that it does not repeat its mistakes again. And also it is important for us and for all the countries in the world to learn the lessons from Sri Lanka, right? So what are the lessons that we can learn from Sri Lanka? First, do not rely on debt for long, right? And this is something you have discussed, that since Sri Lanka's revenue have been going down, they had to borrow a lot of debt, and that is at $51 billion around of foreign debt that they had to get to fund their expenditures, right? So this is not at all a sustainable way. You have to pay back at certain point. But again, Sri Lanka does not have the money to pay back, and as a result, its different rating agencies have been degrading its ratings, and now it is becoming even more difficult for Sri Lanka to borrow money from other countries. Okay, so do not rely on debt for long. No country should rely on debt. No country, no person, no individual should rely on debt for long. Do not depend on freebies. This is one of the essential learnings from the Sri Lankan crisis. Why did Gotabaya Rajapaksa made those sweeping tax cuts? To make people happy, right? Because when you do tax cuts, people have more money in their hand. I think I've already discussed this. People have more money in their hand, so they become happy. Their disposable income, what happens to that? That goes up, because you need to pay less taxes, and so you have more money in hand, so your disposable income goes on. People are happy. But then there has to be some payback time. The expenditure still has to be accounted for. You cannot rely on debt. So whenever people or any political party, anyone promises freebies, always understand that there is a pay time ahead. May not be in the short term, but in the long term, you need to pay it back, right? So do not depend on freebies. No country, no society should depend on freebies. Understand that there are no free meals. Next, do not sacrifice the long-term interests of the country in lieu of short-term electoral and political gains. Exactly what Sri Lanka did. We have to be careful as citizens that the long-term interests of the country need to be taken care of. For short-term political gains, different parties, different politicians make different promises, but the long-term health of the country, we have to make decisions as citizens, as judicious citizens, that the long-term interest of the country is not jeopardized. Sri Lanka essentially had to take the heat because of this. The citizens simply did not understand the long-term interests of the country. The political dispensary did not understand the long-term interests of the country, and just for short-term gains, they are facing all this trouble. And finally, have healthy foreign reserves. One of the things that, again, why Sri Lanka has not been able to bring in more import, because their foreign reserves are not healthy enough. They just do not have enough money to fund their imports. If you talk of India right now has somewhere around $650 billion dollars of foreign reserves, right now, and this is for India. This is a healthy amount. This is for India. This is a healthy amount. This is almost good enough to fund 10 months of import. Okay, this number is somewhere around that, or might be a bit less, but somewhere around that. So this is good enough to fund 10 months of import. This is a good number to have. So every country should aspire to have sufficient foreign reserves so that they can save themselves from crisis of the kind that Sri Lanka faced. Okay, that also keeps your currency much more stabilized. Your currency is also stabilized if you have good foreign reserves. Okay, so these are the learnings that we can get from Sri Lanka. Do not rely on debt, do not depend on freebies, do not sacrifice the long-term interests of the country, and also have very healthy foreign reserves. Okay, so I hope you understood the problem that Sri Lanka is facing. How did they arrive at this problem? What is the road ahead for Sri Lanka? And finally, the lessons that we can learn from Sri Lanka. Okay, thank you so much for watching this. I'll come back to you with another topic. Thank you so much.